Let's talk for just a minute about this amazing molecule called water. Water is absolutely essential for life. Living cells cannot survive without water. When you think about evolution and where living cells emerged from, it turns out that life came out of the oceans. The first life forms, the first cells that existed on planet Earth came about inside the oceans. It makes sense then that even as organisms came up onto dry land, they maintained their watery nature. This is even further supported by the fact that the water that you find inside living cells is not pure water, is it? It's salt water. The water that's inside of you and I, for example, is a salty water. It's approximately 0.9% sodium chloride. You are a salty organism because your ancestors came out of the salty ocean. Humans, in fact, are about 65 to 75% water, salt water. We are watery organisms. Now, the water molecule is highly polar, as we've said. It contains partial charges. It contains polar covalent bonds. So we describe it as a polar molecule. Now, let's talk about what those polar, non-polar terms mean in terms of existing in a watery environment. Because water is polar, water will readily form hydrogen bonds with other polar molecules. These polar molecules are then said to be hydrophilic. Hydrophilic. That term translates as water loving. The partial charges inside a polar molecule will be pulled to, attracted to, the partial charges in water. Hydrophilic, water loving. Now, the other thing that this means to us is that when you take a molecule and a polar molecule, you can dissolve it into water. You can bring it into a watery environment and it will dissolve into that watery environment. We say like dissolves like. So a polar solvent, like water, will dissolve polar molecules, like the sodium chloride we mentioned a moment ago. Now, the polar water molecule will do exactly the opposite when it meets up with a non-polar substance. It will repel it. It will not be attracted to it. It will not be drawn to it. In fact, it will isolate it. So when you put a non-polar molecule into a watery environment, like a cell, that non-polar substance is said to be hydrophobic, which translates as water fearing, and it will become isolated in that environment. Take a look at the drawing on this slide. What's being depicted is chains of hydrocarbon molecules inside water. Now look at the water molecules first. Remember, the red ball represents the oxygen and the white balls represent hydrogen. This is a polar molecule, so it has partial charges in it. The partially negative oxygens are going to be hydrogen bonding with the partially positive hydrogen atoms. You can see those yellow dotted lines all the way through here. And then we have this region in the center. Now the black circles which we haven't seen yet, those represent carbon. And again, the white circles represent hydrogen. So these molecules in here, these are long chains of simply carbon and hydrogen. These are what we call hydrocarbons. This particular hydrocarbon happens to be called octane, but don't worry about that. Just understand that because carbon and hydrogen have the same electronegativity, when they form covalent bonds with each other, they share the pair of electrons equally between them, symmetrically. They are non-polar covalent bonds, in other words. So this non-polar molecule is sitting in a watery environment. And what's happening is it's being completely isolated from the water molecules. There's no interaction going on. It'll interact with itself. The individual hydrocarbons will be attracted to each other with van der Waals interactions, but completely isolated from the water. And of course, you've seen this. You've seen this in your own lives. Think about the last time, for example, that you put a drop of oil into water. Think about the last time you mixed up some salad dressing, or maybe you put a couple drops of olive oil into a pan of water that you're going to use to make pasta. The oil doesn't mix with the water, right? It stays isolated as droplets in the water. Hydrophobic, hydrophilic. When we look at the biologically relevant macromolecules, the polar versus nonpolar chemistry really matters. The hydrophilic versus hydrophobic chemistry matters. It turns out that 3 of the 4 macromolecules are polar overall. They are hydrophilic overall. Now, what do I mean by overall? These are macromolecules. They're big molecules. Protein can have regions in it that are hydrophilic and regions that are hydrophobic. It can have regions that are polar and regions that are nonpolar. But when you look at the entire molecule, its net chemistry is polar. The same is true with carbohydrate. The same is true with nucleic acid. So 3 of the 4 macromolecules are polar overall and hydrophilic. Only lipid, that one macromolecule, is hydrophobic. Now, lipid is the term that we give to the class of the macromolecule, but there are actually 3 kinds of lipid in living cells. The phospholipids, remember, those are the ones that make up the membrane. Fats, or what we also call triglycerides, and the molecule we call sterols. Remember, cholesterol is a sterol. Lipid is hydrophobic. Lipid is non-polar. Now, why does this matter? Why does it matter that the one macromolecule, lipid, is so different from the others? Remember, all living cells are surrounded by a membrane, and that membrane is what creates the compartment of the cell, making it different from and isolated from the rest of the environment. It's the lipid in the membrane that allows the internal environment of a cell to be separate from, isolated from, the world outside. So all life on our planet requires water in order to survive. All life on our planet has another interesting feature, and that is that it is organic. Now, that word means different things to different people, but when it comes to biochemistry, Organic means carbon containing. So living things on our planet are carbon based. You'll often hear people say that the molecules inside living cells have carbon skeletons. They're built around carbon. Carbon is indeed essential for life. It's the skeleton, if you will, of protein, of carbohydrate, of nucleic acid, and of lipid. Now, carbon doesn't exist in a vacuum. Carbon is associated with other atoms. Remember, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen are our four key elements. The way those atoms arrange themselves in biological molecules creates what are called functional groups attached to these carbon skeletons. Now, you may recall that term, functional group, from a previous chemistry class. The reason we refer to regions of molecules as functional groups is because those are the regions that are sort of chemically active. Those are the regions that participate in chemical reactions with other molecules. Those are the regions that give molecules their particular chemical characteristics. Take a look at the drawing over on the right hand of the slide. This is a drawing of an amino acid. Now, amino acids are the building blocks or the subunits of protein. You take amino acids and you join them together in a long chain. And when you have that long chain of amino acids built, you can fold it up and create a protein, a functional protein. Take a look at the structure inside the molecule of amino acid. There's a carbon right in the middle, and there are 4 covalent bonds attached to that carbon. One is simply a hydrogen atom. One is a nitrogen with some hydrogens, and one is another carbon associated with oxygen and hydrogen. Now, when we look at this molecule, this amino acid, we can also see this attached to it. And in this drawing, it's just something that's depicted by the letter R. In chemistry, we refer to functional groups by using this letter uppercase R. What the artist is showing us by drawing that R there is that there are other atoms over here. There are other carbons and hydrogens and oxygens and nitrogens over here. It's just that the combination of those differs from one amino acid to another. In other words, all amino acids have a central carbon with the hydrogen attached, and the nitrogen and hydrogens, and the carbon and oxygens, and so on. All amino acids have the same basic structure. They all also contain a functional group, a side group, or what's sometimes simply called an R group. They all contain some segment of atoms that give each amino acid its own unique chemistry. It's the R group, the functional group on an amino acid, that distinguishes one from the other and helps determine whether that amino acid has polar chemistry or non-polar chemistry, whether or not it has any charges associated with it, positive or negative, and how that amino acid is going to interact with other amino acids and cause the folding that needs to occur to create a protein. It turns out that in amino acids and in other biologically important molecules, there are 6 functional groups that we see most often. So there are 6 types of functional groups that we need to be familiar with. Now, I'm not going to ask you to draw a carbonyl group or anything like that, but I want you to recognize a carbonyl group. I want you to recognize a phosphate group. I want you to know when I say hydroxyl group, what I'm talking about. Okay? So what you're seeing on these 6 functional groups is some combination of atoms that make up that functional group. Now you see that letter R again, so I know this is a little confusing. But when we draw an R as part of a molecule, the R represents a functional group. When we draw an R with a functional group, the R just represents the rest of the molecule. So this is an amino group. And all an amino group is a nitrogen atom and 2 hydrogen atoms. And it's going to be attached to the rest of the molecule. This is a carbonyl group. A carbon double bonded to an oxygen and then attached in 2 places to the rest of the molecule. Here's a carboxyl group, which looks an awful lot like a carbonyl group. The difference is that we have a carbon double bonded to an oxygen, and then we have an OH attached, as well as the rest of the molecule. Down here, this is a hydroxyl group. It's simply an oxygen and a hydrogen attached to the rest of the molecule. This is a phosphate group. This is the most complex functional group that we see over and over again in living cells. It's a phosphorus bonded to 4 oxygen atoms, either single or double bonded. And then 2 of those oxygen atoms are also bonded to hydrogens. So this phosphate group, this is a really important functional group in living cells, and we're going to talk about phosphate groups a lot when we talk about metabolism. So again, I wouldn't ask you to draw this for me, but I want you to be able to recognize it. And when I talk about phosphate groups, I want you to be able to pull up that mental image in your head. The last of the 6 functional groups is called a sulfhydryl group. I don't talk about this one quite as much, but it is important in living cells. And it's simply a sulfur atom bonded to a hydrogen atom attached to the rest of the molecule.